I've always prided myself on being a guy who keeps things orderly, no nonsense. I value structure, routine, and handling responsibilities without getting caught up in emotions or unnecessary drama. Family to me meant sticking to your role, doing what needs to be done. My wife, on the other hand, she wasn't like that. She was laid back, more easygoing. At first, I thought it was a good balance, my discipline, her relaxed nature. But over time, I started seeing it differently. I started seeing her as soft, maybe even weak. We had different roles in life. I worked all day while she stayed home, and honestly, I preferred it that way. The less interference, the better. Things were smooth in the beginning. Our life was predictable, and I liked that. But then, slowly, things began to change. She started getting into books, hanging out with her friends, and spending more and more time at these little cafes, talking about whatever novels they were reading. At first, I didn't mind. She had her thing, I had mine. But over time, it felt like something more. It wasn't just about filling her free time anymore. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but my gut was telling me something wasn't quite right. I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions. I like proof before making any accusations, but my instincts have rarely failed me, and this time they were screaming that something was off. It started with little things. She'd come home after these coffee dates with her friends, and she'd be glowing more than usual. It wasn't just about the books or the conversations. She carried herself differently, and I could feel her slipping away from me. We didn't fight much, and I thought that was a good thing. I set the rules, and she followed them. But as her time away from the house increased, it felt like our connection was fading. I'm not big on sharing feelings. That's just not how I was raised, and it's not how I handle problems. If something needs fixing, you fix it, no need for long emotional talks. I expected her to approach things the same way. But as time passed, it was clear she wasn't wired like me, and it was starting to show. I kept working, staying focused on what needed to get done, while she was off in her world of books and cafe chats. Something was brewing. I could feel it, even if I didn't know exactly what it was yet. One day, she went out with one of her friends. Nothing unusual about that. They'd been spending a lot of time together lately, the two of them. Always at that same cafe, talking about their latest book obsessions or whatever deep conversation they'd had over coffee. I didn't think much of it at first. At least she wasn't doing anything reckless, or so I thought. But when she came home that day, something was different. She seemed happy. No, more than happy, excited, almost giddy in a way I hadn't seen in a while. She walked in with this huge smile on her face, and before I could even ask her what was going on, she started talking about how they met a new group of people at the cafe. She was practically glowing as she told me all about these folks who, apparently, were just as obsessed with books as she and her friend were. It didn't seem like a big deal, just her usual rambling about meeting like-minded people. I tuned out a bit, but then she said something that caught my attention. She mentioned that one of the guys in this new group seemed particularly interested in her friend. She thought it was cute how he kept giving her little compliments and paying extra attention to her. She was so excited about it, going on and on about how her friend deserved to be happy and how this guy seemed like a good match for her. Now, I don't usually get jealous, and this didn't seem like something to be concerned about. I mean, it was just a guy showing interest in her friend, right? But there was something about the way she was talking that made me feel uneasy. She was smiling a little too much, almost like she was more thrilled about this guy than her friend was. It made me pause, though I didn't let on that I was bothered. She kept saying how great it was to meet people who shared their interests, how nice it was to make new friends. She even suggested that I meet them sometime, as if I'd want to hang out with a bunch of book lovers. I just nodded, pretending to be interested, but deep down, something wasn't sitting right with me. Looking back, that excitement in her eyes, that spark, it wasn't just about her friend. I could feel it in my gut. She was into this new crowd, into these new people, and it wasn't just about the books anymore. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but now I realize it was the beginning of something. Something I wasn't ready for. As the weeks went on, this new group of friends became a regular part of our lives. It didn't take long before we were all hanging out, doing dinners and drinks together, mostly because her friend had started seeing that guy from the cafe. Naturally, that meant I got pulled into it too. At first, I didn't care. They seemed like a normal group of people. Nothing special. But my wife was clearly enjoying herself, so I went along with it, just keeping things cordial. But there was one guy in particular that stood out to me. From the moment I met him, I got a bad feeling. He wasn't loud or obnoxious, didn't do anything outright suspicious, but something about him set off alarms in my head. The way he carried himself, the way he looked at people, it was like he was sizing them up, always calculating. He was the kind of guy you don't trust, the kind of guy who you instinctively know is trouble. He had that look, that air about him, like someone who's capable of doing something reckless without giving it a second thought. I kept my mouth shut at first. I didn't want to seem paranoid, especially with my wife enjoying these new social gatherings. But as time went on, I couldn't ignore how close this guy seemed to be getting to her. It was subtle, he wasn't obvious about it, but he always managed to be near her, in her conversations, sharing inside jokes. It wasn't enough to call him out, but it was enough to make me watch him a little more closely. Trust doesn't come easily to me. Never has. And I definitely didn't trust this guy. Something about him felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was working his way into our lives for a reason. He seemed too comfortable, like he knew he was welcomed but didn't belong. And the way my wife interacted with him, the ease between them, made my gut churn. I wasn't ready to make any accusations, but I started keeping an eye on things, watching their interactions more carefully. I've always believed that people like him eventually slip up, and when they do, they show their true intentions. I just had to wait for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. One day, I came home and saw boot prints near the front door. My wife didn't wear boots like that, and I sure didn't. They were the kind you'd find on heavy work boots, the kind neither of us had a reason to be wearing. When I casually asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying maybe one of her friends had stopped by earlier. I didn't push the issue, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I have an eye for details, and once something catches my attention, it's hard for me to let it go. It wasn't just the boots either. Over time, I started to get this feeling when I walked into the house, like the air had shifted, like someone else had been in my space. Things would be slightly out of place. A book that wasn't where it should be. A pillow on the couch that looked like it had been moved. Nothing huge, nothing that screamed something's wrong, but enough to make me stop and notice. At first, I chalked it up to my wife being careless or distracted, but the more these little things piled up, the more I started to wonder if there was something more going on. It wasn't just the house either. My wife had been acting different, subtle, but there. She was more distracted, more distant, and every time she came back from one of her outings with this new group, she had this glow about her that didn't sit right with me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. Then came the day when everything clicked. Up until that point, I had been dealing with a gut feeling, nothing concrete. But that day, things changed. I came home, and the moment I walked through the door, I felt it. Something was off, more than usual. The air was heavier, colder. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew something had happened, something I wasn't ready for. That night changed everything. That evening, after a long day at work, I walked into the house expecting the usual routine. But the second I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like something had happened while I was gone. I could hear my wife in the living room, so I headed in that direction. What I saw next threw me off. She was sitting on the couch, slouched over, with a half-empty bottle of wine next to her, clearly drunk. And this wasn't just a casual glass of wine like we sometimes had together. She was properly drunk, which was strange because she rarely drank by herself, let alone to this extent. I asked her what was going on, trying to keep my voice calm, even though alarm bells were going off in my head. She looked up at me with glassy eyes and slurred something about her friend coming over earlier. According to her, they'd been talking about some fight her friend had with her boyfriend, and somehow they'd ended up drinking too much. She laughed it off, trying to make it seem like no big deal. But the story didn't sit right with me. Her friend had never been the type to drag her into those kinds of late-night, drunken conversations, especially not on a weekday. I nodded along, pretending to believe her, but inside, that gnawing suspicion I'd been trying to ignore was growing stronger. Something was off, and I was about to find out just how deep it went. As soon as I could, I stepped into the hallway and quietly pulled out my phone. I decided to call her friend, just to see if her story checked out. I kept my voice low, not wanting my wife to overhear me. When her friend answered, she sounded completely normal, sober, even. I casually asked her how she was doing, and after a bit of hesitation, she admitted that she hadn't been over to our house that day at all. My stomach dropped. I pressed her a little more, asking if she'd had a fight with her boyfriend like my wife had said. Again, there was that hesitation, followed by the truth. There hadn't been any fight. There was no reason for her to have been drinking with my wife. I hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, trying to process everything. My wife had lied to me, flat out lied. And now I had to ask myself why. What was she hiding? Deep down, I already knew the answer, but I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. Not without more proof. I told her I had a headache and was going to bed early. She mumbled something in response, too drunk to care. But as I walked down the hall, my mind was racing. Something didn't add up, and I was determined to find out what it was. When I opened the bedroom door, something immediately caught my eye. The bed. The sheets had been changed, and we had just changed them a couple of days ago. That wasn't like us. We weren't the type of people to switch out the bed linen that often. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. There was a reason the sheets had been changed, and it wasn't a good one. I walked over to the laundry basket, where we tossed our dirty clothes. My hands were shaking as I started digging through it, searching for the old sheets. When I finally pulled them out, there it was, a large, unmistakable stain right in the center of the sheet. That was all the proof I needed. My worst suspicions had been confirmed. Standing there with that crumpled, stained sheet in my hands, everything came crashing down. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me or overreacting. It was real. Someone else had been here. And deep down, I knew exactly who it was. That guy, the one from our new group of friends, the one I'd never trusted from the start. I could see his face flashing in my mind. He was the one. The way he always found his way next to my wife, the way she seemed different after spending time around him. I had ignored my instincts, but now it was all so clear. He hadn't just wormed his way into our social circle. He'd wormed his way into my marriage. Anger started boiling inside me. This wasn't just some random betrayal. This was in my own home, in the life I had worked to build. I didn't need to ask her for explanations. I didn't need to hear her side of the story because I already knew everything I needed to know. Now, I just needed to figure out what I was going to do about it. I wasn't the type to sit back and let someone walk all over me. No, I wasn't going to let this slide. But I wasn't about to explode in a fit of rage either. I'm more calculated than that. If they thought they could sneak around behind my back, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Over the next few days, I kept my cool. I acted normal, didn't let on that I knew anything. Meanwhile, I started planning. I knew I needed proof, undeniable proof. Something that neither my wife nor that guy could weasel their way out of. So, I set a trap. I ordered a hidden camera online, and when it arrived, I carefully placed it in our bedroom, tucked away where they'd never see it. I connected it to a live feed on my phone, so I could watch everything in real time. I didn't tell my wife anything, didn't give her any reason to suspect I was on to her. I let her think I was oblivious while I quietly waited for them to slip up. It didn't take long. A few days later, I told her I had to work late. I kissed her goodbye like it was just another day. But instead of going to work, I parked a few blocks away and waited. I watched the live feed on my phone, my heart racing as I saw him pull up to the house. My wife greeted him at the door, all smiles, like this was just another casual visit. I waited as they moved to the bedroom, and when they finally crossed that line, I hit record. Watching them on that screen, it was like something inside me broke. The anger, the betrayal, all of it hit me at once. But instead of confronting them right then and there, I watched. I made sure I had everything I needed. The next morning, after they thought they'd gotten away with it, I calmly called my lawyer. I wasn't going to just kick her out and scream about how she'd destroyed our marriage. No, I was going to handle this the right way, on my terms. The divorce was swift. She didn't see it coming. I handed her the evidence, and she didn't even try to deny it. There was nothing left to say. She packed her things and left, just like that. As for that guy, well, I made sure he knew he was no longer welcome in any circle I was a part of. I didn't need to lay a hand on him. He knew what he'd done, and he knew he wouldn't be coming around again. In the end, I came out of this stronger. Betrayal might cut deep, but it also teaches you who you can trust, and who you can't. I moved on, built a life free of lies, and I've never looked back. It's funny, really. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who bring everything crashing down, but that's when you find out who you really are.